The kettle was already screaming by the time Catherine made it downstairs. She stood in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown, hair still half pinned from last night, and just watched it. The steam, the noise, the ordinary, ridiculous, beautiful noise of a Saturday morning doing what Saturday mornings do. She hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. Not badly, not terribly, just that kind of sleep where your body lies down and your mind decides it has admin to catch up on. Lists, faces, the color she still hadn't chosen for the hallway at Adelaide Cottage, whether she'd remembered to text her mother back. She hadn't. She turned the kettle off and stood there in the quiet that followed, both hands flat on the counter. Outside, through the kitchen window, the garden was doing that thing it does in early spring, that tentative, almost shy unfurling, where the green comes back like it's not sure it's allowed. The cherry tree her father-in-law had always admired was starting to blossom. Just the edges, just the outermost branches, where the light hit first. She heard him before she saw him. William's footsteps on the stairs, that particular rhythm, unhurried but deliberate, the walk of a man who has long since stopped rushing and started simply moving through his life like he owns it. Which, technically, in many cases he does. She told him that once, and he'd laughed in a way that seemed genuinely startled, like the thought hadn't occurred to him. She loved that about him, still, after everything. "You're up." He appeared in the doorway, George's old rugby jumper on, the one with the fraying collar he absolutely refused to throw away. He looked at her hands on the counter, then at her face, and did that thing, that quiet reading of her, that he'd gotten frighteningly good at over the years. "I'm up," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen without another word, reached past her for the kettle, refilled it, and switched it back on. Then he stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and they both watched the garden. "Today's going to be good," he said, not reassurance, not performance, just his version of "I see you, we're okay." She leaned her head against his arm. The cherry tree held its blossoms like it was trying not to let go. Her mother had offered to come early. To help with the setup, she'd said, in that voice she used when she meant something entirely different, when she really meant "I want to be there before the nerves set in, before you've armored up, while you're still just you." Carol Middleton understood her eldest daughter in ways Catherine had spent years finding uncomfortable, and now, somewhere in her late 30s, had simply started being grateful for. "Come at 10, Catherine had told her. "Bring whatever you'd like, just come." She arrived at 9:47. Catherine heard the car on the gravel and felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she hadn't known was pulled tight. She pressed her fingers against the hallway wall for half a second. Then she opened the door. Her mother stepped out carrying a tin that smelled of lemon drizzle before she'd even opened the boot, and Catherine started laughing, properly laughing, the kind that has no performance in it because of course. Of course she'd brought cake. Carol Middleton's answer to grief was cake, and her answer to joy was also cake, and honestly, after enough years, you start to see the wisdom in that. "I know you said not to fuss," her mother said, coming up the path with the tin under one arm and a bunch of daffodils that were frankly an entire bush under the other. "I didn't say not to fuss. You said it's just a casual day, Mum." "That is casual for you." Carol laughed, kissed her cheek, walked straight in like she'd been here 1,000 times because she had, and Catherine stood in the open doorway for a moment, cold air on her face, watching a blackbird land on the cherry tree branch and not knock a single blossom loose. Sometimes mornings are trying to tell you something. She chose to listen. Pippa arrived 20 minutes later with James, and the children bundled in varying levels of readiness. One boot on, one boot off, the kind of coordinated chaos that only families with young children achieve. James had the look of a man who had attempted the morning with genuine optimism and been defeated by it 3 separate times before 10 o'clock. Pippa had the look of a woman who had stopped counting defeats years ago and was simply moving forward. She refused to wear the other boot, Pippa said, by way of greeting, nodding at her youngest. Noted, said Catherine. I told her she could be Cinderella. Clever. She didn't buy it. The children cascaded into the hallway like something released from a bottle, noise and energy, and small elbows going everywhere. And the cottage filled up in an instant, became the loud, warm, slightly too full thing that Catherine had been quietly aching for without realizing it. William appeared at the top of the stairs with George, both of them now also wearing rugby jumpers, different ones, an accident that was somehow not an accident, and George's expression when he saw his cousins was the exact face William made when something genuinely delighted him. Not the public smile, the real one, the unguarded one. Catherine saw it and had to look away. Not because it hurt, because it was almost too much to hold. Michael arrived last. He'd walked part of the way, he said, because the morning was too good to waste inside a car. He had a bottle of something under each arm and his collar was slightly muddy at the back, and he looked exactly like her father always looked on the best days. Exactly like the version of him she'd built her whole idea of what a good man was from, back when she was small enough that his shoulders were the highest place in the world. He stopped when he saw her face. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm glad you're here. He nodded once, the way men like him nod when words would be too much. The kettle screamed again from the kitchen. And the day began. William had insisted on the garden. Catherine had looked at the weather forecast twice. He'd looked at it once, said it'll hold, and gone out to move the table himself. That was the kind of optimism she'd married, not blind, not reckless, just the quiet decision that some things are worth betting on. He was right. The sky held, pale and cool and washed with thin gold light, the kind that softens everything it touches, the edges of faces, the cracks in old stone, the tiredness behind people's eyes. They ate outside. Carol had commandeered the kitchen somewhere between the arrivals and the first round of tea and produced, with what Catherine could only describe as military efficiency disguised as nonchalance, a spread that made James say, "Right, we're never hosting again," under his breath. Pippa heard him, elbowed him. He didn't look sorry. The table was too small for everyone. They'd known it would be. William had found 2 extra chairs in the shed that wobbled at different frequencies, and Charlotte had immediately appointed herself the person responsible for documenting this wobble with great scientific seriousness. She pressed her small palm flat on the table's surface, felt it shift, and said, "Yep, that one's broken," with the confidence of someone delivering a formal verdict. "It's characterful," William said. "It's broken," Charlotte said. "Charlotte," Catherine started. "She's not wrong," said Michael, which made everyone laugh, and the table wobbled and no one cared. George sat beside his grandfather. This was not arranged. It was simply where he ended up, the way water finds the lowest point naturally, without being asked. He was at that age now where he was trying very hard to be older than he was, and occasionally succeeding, and Michael Middleton was one of the few people around whom he stopped trying and just sat. Catherine watched them over the rim of her glass. Her father was saying something about cricket, she could tell by the angle of his hands, and George was listening with the focused, slightly skeptical expression that meant he was genuinely engaged but hadn't fully made up his mind yet. Michael glanced up, caught Catherine watching, and something passed between them. Quick, wordless. "He's going to be all right." She looked down at her plate. The cherry tree moved in the light wind and dropped 3 blossoms onto the table. William reached over and picked one up, turned it over in his fingers, set it down by her glass like a small offering. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. The conversation went the way the best conversations do, not in a line but in a current, people dropping in and out, voices overlapping and diverging and finding each other again across the noise of children and the clinking of glasses and the particular sound of Carol laughing at something Pippa had said that Catherine had missed. James told a story about a camping trip that had gone wrong in so many simultaneous ways that by the third disaster everyone at the table was leaning in. And by the fifth, William had his hand over his mouth in that way he had when he was trying not to laugh loudly, which only made it worse, which made it better. Michael, who had heard the story before, was watching everyone else laugh, wearing the expression of a man who has discovered that other people's joy is its own kind of currency. Pippa said, "James, you didn't tell me about the goat." "I was hopping, no one would ask about the goat." "The goat," repeated George, with a new quality of attention. "There was a goat." Charlotte put her fork down. This was serious. "There was a goat," James confirmed, with the gravity of a man confessing. What followed was approximately 14 minutes that Catherine would carry with her for years. The particular way the light came through the blossoms, the sound of her mother laughing until she cried, Charlotte standing on her chair to act out the goat, apparently with no brief having been given, all four limbs engaged, William catching Catherine's eye and holding it, and both of them being, for just that moment, entirely inside the same moment, not a previous one, not a future one. Just this. Just the table and the blossoms, and the wobble and the goat. It was Pippa who said it eventually. Not planned. Catherine could tell it wasn't planned because Pippa's eyes went slightly wide just after the words came out, like she'd surprised herself. They'd been talking about something else entirely. The garden, what to do with the back corner, whether a raised bed was practical or aspirational. When Pippa just said, quietly, into a small gap in the conversation, "I'm really glad we're all here." Nothing dramatic about it. No tears. Just placed it there on the table between the glasses and the crumbs and the goat story, like setting down something you'd been carrying without knowing it. Carol reached over and put her hand on Pippa's. Michael nodded. William, who was never quite sure what to do with moments that weren't framed as questions, looked at the table and then at Catherine and then at the tree and said, "Yeah." Which was exactly right. Charlotte sat back down from her goat reenactment and looked around at all the adults being strangely quiet and decided, with the pragmatism of a 7-year-old who has more important concerns, to eat the rest of the lemon drizzle. Nobody stopped her. The afternoon light shifted, got a little warmer. The pale gold deepened into something richer, something that sat at the backs of people's necks and made them reluctant to go inside. They stayed at the table longer than anyone had planned. Nobody planned to plan anything. That was the whole point. The children left the table first, the way they always do, not by asking permission but by simply disappearing, their energy finding a new trajectory the moment sitting still was no longer interesting. The garden absorbed them. There was some kind of game being negotiated in the far corner, the rules of which shifted every 90 seconds as the power dynamic evolved. The adults stayed. More tea appeared. Someone produced a second bottle of something. The conversation dropped in register lower, slower, the kind of talking that happens when people have eaten well and laughed properly, and the afternoon has given everyone permission to be a little more honest. Michael leaned back in his chair, the non-wobbling one, which he'd quietly commandeered with the expertise of a man who had spent decades navigating family gatherings, and looked up at the sky for a long moment. "Do you remember," he said, to nobody in particular, "that time we did the garden party for your birthday?" He was looking at Carol now. "And it rained so badly that we moved the whole thing into the garage and just pretended that was the plan." "We had a lovely time in that garage," Carol said. "We did," he said. "That's what I mean." Catherine understood what he meant. She thought she'd always understood it, somewhere, that idea that location is largely irrelevant, that the right people create the room they're in, that a garage on a drenched afternoon is just another version of a garden on a perfect spring day if the people are the same people. She looked across the table at her mother, who was still faintly damp-eyed from the laughter earlier, and was pretending not to be by examining the daffodils she'd brought, adjusting them slightly in their jug for no reason except that it gave her hands something to do. Catherine said, "Mum." Carol looked up. "Thank you for the cake." It was not about the cake. Her mother knew it was not about the cake. "Of course," she said, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. William found her later, standing at the edge of the garden where the cherry tree was. The children had been corralled toward the television inside, some negotiation involving a film and the specific number of biscuits considered acceptable, and the garden had gone quiet in the particular way it does when children leave it, all that absence of noise sitting where the noise had been. She'd just ended up at the tree, the way you end up somewhere without deciding to go there. He stood beside her, not touching, just present in the way he knew how to be present, which was mostly just standing, staying, being undeniably there. "You okay?" he asked. The question he asked when he already knew the answer, and just needed her to say something out loud so the thing could breathe. "I was thinking about last year," she said. "Not the details, just the shape of it, the weight of it, the specific variety of tired she'd carried for months that was different from ordinary tired in ways she didn't always have vocabulary for." He didn't say anything, right answer. "And then I was thinking about today." She paused. "And I was thinking those two things happened in the same life, both of them, which feels." She stopped. The word she'd reached for wasn't quite right. None of them were quite right. He said, "Yeah." Again, exactly right again. The man had a gift for agreeing with things that hadn't been fully said. She laughed, a small one, pulled out of her without planning, and he turned slightly toward her and his hand found her shoulder, and she let herself lean into it. Just for a moment. Just the weight of one person against another in a garden in the early evening. A blossom dropped from the tree and landed in her hair. He didn't tell her. She found it later in the mirror and stood there a moment looking at it before she took it out. The goodbyes were long in the way Middleton goodbyes always are. There is a gene, Catherine had concluded, somewhere in that particular strand of family DNA that makes departures impossible to execute efficiently. You say goodbye at the table, then you say it again at the door. Then there is a third goodbye at the car, which fractures into 4 separate smaller goodbyes because something is always remembered. The tin, the spare umbrella, the thing that needs to be said that didn't get said inside. She didn't mind. She stood on the front step and watched her mother's car reverse down the drive, and felt the evening settling in around the house like it was pulling a blanket around its own shoulders. George appeared beside her. He'd lost the rugby jumper somewhere and gained a smear of something blue on his left forearm that no one had explained, and that she decided not to investigate. "Was today a good day?" he asked. The question was genuine. He asked it the way children ask things directly, without the layer of already knowing that adults develop and sometimes can't remove. She looked at him, at his father's eyes in her father's face, the same way she sometimes caught herself doing, nodding the inheritance, the continuance, the extraordinary ordinary fact of it. "Yeah," she said, "today was a good day." He nodded, thought about it, then said, "Because of the goat story." She laughed, actually laughed. "Partly because of the goat story." He seemed satisfied with that and went back inside, feet loud on the flagstones, leaving her on the step with the cool evening air and the smell of blossoms and the sound of William inside somewhere telling Charlotte to please put the good mugs back where the good mugs go. She stood there 1 more minute. Just standing, just being in it. The cherry tree had kept most of its blossoms through the whole long afternoon. A few had gone, to the table, to her hair, to the wind, but most of them held on, pale and patient, doing the quiet, determined thing that spring does. She went inside. Behind her the garden went still, the blossoms held. And somewhere in the house, Charlotte dropped a mug. It didn't break. And